Now is Congressman Khanna of California. He sits on the Armed Services Committee. And let me just have you respond to the rhetoric, what we've heard here from North Korea. This is kind of played back and forth over and over again. We've had sanctions and more sanctions. Have we reached the end of the line, as you see it, when it comes to what the UN and what the U.S. is able to do when it comes to sanctions?
Well, it's appalling rhetoric, and I give our team credit for getting the sanctions unanimously through, with Russia and China backing us. North Korea is declaring war not just on the United States, but also threatening Russia and China and every country that voted for the sanctions. That said, I still think that we need a diplomatic approach. That's what South Korea has called on, and we need to explore a diplomatic alternative like President Clinton did in the 1990s.
Let me ask you about something the President tweeted. He said the United Nations Security Council just voted 15-0, as you said, unanimously, in favor of additional sanctions on North Korea. The world wants peace, not death. From your vantage on the House Armed Services Committee, how much of the conversation has shifted to talking about military alternatives versus the diplomatic solutions you say you'd prefer?
Unfortunately, I think there has been too much of an emphasis on military solutions, but even Secretary Mattis realizes that's not really feasible. I mean, 1 million people would die if North Korea retaliated, and it's telling that South Korea is the country that wants us to engage in diplomacy. That diplomacy can involve a few things. First, we need to have a clear line of communication with North Korea so we can de-escalate any conflict based on miscalculation. Second, we ought to make sure that they're taking measures not to have more nuclear strikes. And we should talk about the size of our joint military exercises and assure them that we don't want regime change. President Clinton took this approach in the 1990s. It was quite successful. We need to go to the table again. And the people who are most at risk in South Korea, that's what they want us to do.
Congressman Khanna, I want you to help me with some nuance here, if you could, a bit of semantics. I looked at something that Secretary of Defense James Mattis said now just about a week ago. He said, quote, "It is not yet shown to be a capable threat against us right now." What does that word capable mean? What's the significance of that adjective the Secretary of Defense has been using when he talks about North Korea's capability?
Well, I think as the representative of Silicon Valley, it concerns me because there is this threat. Could North Korea put a nuclear warhead on an intercontinental ballistic missile and strike the United States? And, of course, Silicon Valley would be a target. And I think Secretary Mattis is saying that they don't have that capability yet, which is, of course, reassuring. But we are all concerned whether they would develop that capability. And that is why a diplomatic approach to prevent them from doing so is so important.
In that ad hoc signing ceremony in the Oval Office before the president left for Florida, he signed something he referred to as a $4 billion missile defense bill. That, of course, was the continuing resolution with some provisions in there for missile defense. How right is that focus on this administration to be investing more money here in missile defense as we look at this issue in particular?
Well, we need to look at the facts. Look, I'm all for developing missile defense, but here are the facts about this. Only 50% of these ground interceptors have worked. And I don't want to have a 50% chance if some ballistic missile comes towards us that it would be intercepted. Second, the problem with this funding is they're saying that they should develop additional ground interceptors before doing the testing. My view is, why don't we first do the testing, make sure these things are working before spending additional money. Finally, I don't think we should be lulled into a false sense of security. We need to be honest with the American people that these anti-missile ground interceptors only have about a 50% chance of working. And what we really need is a diplomatic approach. We shouldn't just think that we are immune because we have this anti-missile defense technology. So I think the facts here really are important, and we should be honest with the American people about our capabilities.
You're on the Armed Services Committee, as I mentioned. I believe you're on the Budget Committee as well. And I want to ask you just about the consequences of the continuing resolution I just mentioned. Some people still whisper about regular order in Washington, D.C., but it's been a long time since we've had a traditional budget process. Have CRs become the new normal in Washington? What are the consequences for that when it comes to the Defense Department in particular?
Well, David, you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, they have become the new normal, and if you talk to anyone in our military, they will say it's an awful way of planning. It restricts them We want to get a budget resolution, but I heard your earlier guest talking about the Dreamers, and I was one of the Democrats, among others, who believe that we need a solution to the Dreamers before we just allow government to go on, that it's a moral issue. So we're going to have a lot of work to do when we get back after the holidays to get a real budget, not just the continuing resolutions, and to solve the issue with the Dreamers.
Let me ask you if you're comfortable. One last question here about a policy decision here. The State Department giving weapons to Ukraine. Obviously, there's been a tremendous amount of tension between Ukraine and Russia. How comfortable are you with that policy move when you look at it from a defense perspective?
I thought it was a mistake, and I was surprised because this president, this administration has talked about de-escalating the crisis with Russia. We, of course, were involved with encouraging at first the coup in Ukraine. I think it's been a mistake to have NATO expanded in Ukraine or to push for the European Union to expand there. We should have Ukraine as a neutral buffer nation which doesn't threaten Russia. So I think it's just going to escalate the violence to put the missile defense there. And I was frankly surprised that this administration, given their prior comments, is taking that step.
All right, the
I
gentleman
did
from
want to,
the
David, at the end, wish you and everyone a Merry Christmas over the holidays. Despite all the difficult issues, I do hope people will get some break over the holidays.
To you as well. The gentleman from the 17th District in California, Congressman Khanna, joining me today from Florida.